5 UFC fighters who held onto submissions for way too long. There is a famous old saying in MMA, tap or snap. It preaches the importance of safety because sometimes holding on for too long can be the difference between whether you live to fight another day or not. Fighters are advised that they should tap out when they feel they can't get out of the submissions, but sometimes, even after they do tap out, the submission doesn't end. The attacker has blood in his eyes and the tap is not enough. Let's look at 5 times UFC fighters held onto submissions for too long. Number 5. George Sotiropoulos. Famously known as one of MMA's nice guys, George Sotiropoulos had no intention to hurt Joe Lauzon at UFC 123 when he locked in a second-round Kimura, forcing J-Lo to tap out. But without any fault of his own, he was almost forced to do it anyway. In this occasion, the submission wasn't held too long through any harm intended, but due to the incompetence of the referee. After a back-and-forth first brutal round, Sotiropoulos was able to gain an upper hand on Lauzon, and using his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, the fierce Australian fighter locked up a Kimura directly onto the left arm of J-Lo. Lauzon responded by tapping out almost immediately, but inexperienced referee Mark Fennell did not catch the tap and missed it completely. The result? Sotiropoulos had to continue to crank the arm, clearly thinking that if he released his opponent, the fight would continue. Fennell thankfully spotted the submission a moment later and finally stepped in to end the fight, but both the fighters were furious at him, drilling the official for his poor positioning. Thankfully, Lauzon walked out fine from the long submission. Number 4. Royce Gracie. The first ever UFC event, long ago on November 12, 1993, saw the legendary Royce Gracie showcase the art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the world by bringing 3 opponents down in the promotion's inaugural tournament. The style is commonly known as the gentle art. Gracie was in no way gentle with the final opponent Gerard Jordeau. In fact, he was far from it. Jordeau, a Dutch kickboxer, had beaten his 2 previous opponents in the tournament by TKO, but Gracie was clearly a trickier opponent. And so when the Brazilian took him down, the Dutchman bit Gracie's ear in an intentional foul. Gracie responded with slapping on a rear naked choke, and despite Jordeau tapping out quickly, he kept on tightening it up until the referee had to step in. Surprisingly, the overly long choke was ignored at the time, but has been frowned upon since, especially because of the story of the bite, which Jordeau himself confirmed has sneaked its way into MMA folklore. Fortunately, there were no hard feelings between the 2 rivals. Jordeau humbly admitted Gracie had been the stronger fighter. And in 2012, the Brazilian visited the Dutchman's gym in The Hague, and they trained together almost 20 years after their legendary fight. Number 3. Renato Babalu Sobral. Credits to his intense personality and ferocious fighting style, Renato Babalu Sobral made a name for himself and became a firm fan favorite in the UFC during the mid-2000s. And although lost in a light heavyweight title fight with Chuck Liddell in 2006, he was still acclaimed as one of the best 205-pounders in the UFC, and his future seemed full of potentials. Interestingly though, just after a year after his loss to Liddell, Sobral was released from the promotion. The reason for the release? His shocking submission of David Heath at UFC 74 in a famous fight became way too personal, for no good reason at all. Babalu came into the fight looking for blood and beat Heath bloody during the first round. And when Heath tried to shoot for a takedown early in the second round, the Brazilian jumped back and locked on a tight snake choke. Only mere seconds later, while covered in his own blood, Heath tapped out. But it seemed to not be good enough for Sobral, who blatantly ignored the referee and continued to tighten his grip until his opponent became unconscious. Even the crowd was horrified, booing Sobral mercilessly, but the Brazilian felt no remorse, later stating that Heath called him a motherfucker at the weigh-in and needed to learn respect the hard way. The trash talk that UFC fighters throw at one another is very common, and it shouldn't have been a big deal. To say this was an overreaction, that would be an understatement. It came as no surprise when he was cut from the promotion. UFC President Dana White described the act as completely unacceptable. Number 2. BJ Penn. During his near 2-decade career with the UFC, Hawaiian legend BJ Penn was involved in some of the UFC's most famous and intense feuds, and his rivalries with other UFC fighters like George St. Pierre, Matt Hughes, and Sean Shirk are still well remembered by longtime MMA fans today. But perhaps his most hated feud came against Gen's Lil Evil Pulver. The Prodigy had challenged Pulver for the UFC lightweight title in January 2002, but despite coming in as the betting favorite, the Prodigy lost thanks to the champion's superior fighting skills. After the fight, Lil Evil said that he felt disrespected by the number of people who had counted him out, and evidently, Penn couldn't swallow the defeat. Jump forward 6 years, the UFC decided to give the lightweight division a bigger showdown by devoting an entire season of The Ultimate Fighter to it. Penn and Pulver were named as the coaches for the season. The cherry on top? The two veterans were booked to face off against one another at the finale show. The rivalry instantly made it to the headlines, with the two men beefing on the TUF set and Pulver promising to knock Penn's teeth out in the fight. The Prodigy, as a response, told Pulver he would break his left shoulder. Although Penn clearly dominated the fight, he didn't keep his promise. He never went for his rival's arm, instead locking in a second-round near-naked choke to force the former champion to submit, and to send a silent and deadly message to Pulver. The Prodigy kept the choke locked in a little too long, even with the referee attempting to separate the fighters. It is surprising that the infraction went largely ignored, perhaps because Pulver didn't fall unconscious during the hold. The silver lining to this fight is that the feud ended with it and the veteran said he would love to train with the Prodigy. And number 1, Rousimar Palhares. All of the previous fighters on this list held a submission for too long on just one occasion, and all 4 of them had their reasons for doing so. However sketchy those reasons might have been. Brazilian leg lock expert Rousimar Palhares, on the other hand, became notorious for cranking on his submission holds for far too long, and even found himself released from 2 promotions for it. Toquinho came into the UFC in 2008 with a reputation as one of the world's most dangerous submission fighters, with the dangerous heel hook, a move which can destroy an opponent's knee joint, being his specialty. The Brazilian quickly put together a record of 3-1 in the octagon, with 1 trademark heel hook to his name, before getting into hot water during a 2010 clash with Tomasz Drwal. Palhares again locked up a heel hook on his foe, but despite the Polish fighter clearly tapping out, Toquinho chose to ignore both the tap and referee Kevin Mohol's attempts to stop the fight. Drwal was badly injured by the hold, and after the fight, Palhares was suspended by the New Jersey State Athletic Commission for his actions. 3 years later, this nasty habit reared its head again. This time Palhares, who had dropped to 170 pounds, faced Mike Pierce, and after locking in another heel hook, he again refused to release the submission despite Pierce tapping and the referee attempting to break the hold. Following this incident, the UFC decided to wash their hands of the Brazilian and promptly released him from his contract. Toquinho resurfaced in 2014 in the World Series of Fighting promotion, but controversy continued to follow him. After submitting Steve Carl and John Fitch, and again being accused of holding his submissions, this time an inverted heel hook and a knee bar for too long, he faced Jake Shields, and after eye gouging the veteran early in the fight, he submitted him with a Kimura. Again, Palhares was up to his old tricks, holding onto the Kimura for far too long despite Shields tapping. The Nevada State Athletic Commission slapped him with another suspension, and WSOF quickly released the Brazilian from his contract. Nearly a decade on, Toquinho remains perhaps the most notorious submission fighter in MMA history, and despite plenty of attempts to explain his questionable behavior, the truth is that we'll probably never know the reason for his bad habit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you guys enjoyed. Until next time.